Good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study for Friday, October 2024. Is that right? No, 25. Excuse me. Of course. Tuesday was the 22nd. There's a reason I know that. So October 22 was on Tuesday, and then obviously today is the 25th. And on the 22nd, and I found this and watched some of it yesterday, on the interstate, about 20 miles from where we live, a motorhome pulled over to the side of the road with a very hot driver's side rear wheel, so hot that after he stopped, the motorhome caught fire, and in the end the motorhome burned down to the frame. The fire on the motorhome caught the grass and brush on next to the interstate on fire, and for a bit there was a pretty vigorous fire in the underbrush. Well, once the underbrush and dry grass and all had burned, that fire died away. And it the triangle that is formed when you have a road that crosses the interstate itself, and then the entrance road from the crossing highway down to the interstate. Not even all of that. And yet the YouTuber who posted the video titled it Massive Wildfire. It wasn't a wild fire. It was started by human intervention. It was a forest fire, perhaps, but it was mostly just the underbrush. It wasn't massive. And it pretty much died on its own accord. It was pretty much out by the time the fire department got there to deal with the motorhome, which, of course, was completely burned up. So whoever it was probably lost a lot of belongings that they had stored in that motorhome because they wouldn't have had time to get them out. Now, my thought on that was that if your motorhome is generating that kind of heat in a wheel, the wheel has to be dragging, and you should notice that in the way your vehicle steers. Years ago, I was driving back to college from home. There was a young lady riding with me, and I noticed that my car just wasn't driving right. I ended up pulling over to the side of the road, and the passenger side front wheel was awfully hot. So I stopped, called my dad, and my dad came, picked us up, took us to college, and then he got a friend of his to come pick the car up and take it back and look at it. Turns out that the brake caliper on that side had seized up and wasn't releasing, so that brake was always on. So I know that if you have a situation that would make a wheel hot, there is a way to notice it. So I'm not trying to accuse the person. I'm just saying that he may have been inexperienced and not noticed that his vehicle was pulling like that in order to get so far that he has a major fire like that. So anyway, a week ago tomorrow, I did get a Bible question from the site that I'm a volunteer with, and I'm going to go ahead and read that at this time, read my answer. And this is kind of interesting because some of you will know the ideas behind the question and know where they come from. Made it a little awkward for me given the site that I'm volunteering with. The question was sent on the 18th by Alvin, and he writes, "How do we know Adam was not with Eve when she was speaking with the serpent?" Excuse me. Dear Alvin, thank you for visiting our site and for submitting your question about Eve and the serpent. The short answer is we don't. The position that the man was away at the time comes from an extra-biblical source. In keeping with our name, we do not rely on sources outside the Bible, regardless of how reliable and even inspired we believe the writer to have been. As an aside, the woman was not called Eve until after this story. Her husband is never called anything but the man. Our translators have chosen to transliterate the Hebrew for man to give this person the name Adam. To illustrate how the idea that he wasn't there may have started, let me quote from the King James Version, almost exclusively used in the 19th century English world, and even in the first half of the 20th century. I was raised in almost exclusively King James world. We were aware that there were other versions, but we didn't refer to them all that often, although my dad did occasionally like to use the Phillips translation. At any rate, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Genesis 3:6, that's out of the King James Version, of course. The problem with the King James is that it uses a language we no longer speak, so the sentence structure and some of the words seem clunky and awkward to us. Furthermore, the meaning of some English words has changed over the years, so that an accurate translation in 1611 no longer bears the same accuracy. Let's read the same verse from a more modern translation and see if anything changes. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. That's Genesis 3:6 out of the New International Version. The translators of the NIV have rendered the text to explicitly say the man was with her at the time. Some who hold to the validity of the extra-biblical source that says the man wasn't there use this as an excuse to denigrate the NIV and any other modern translation that renders this text the same way. This particular detail makes little difference to the importance of the story, which tells us how the first two humans believed the lies of the arch-deceiver, called a serpent or dragon throughout the Bible, and wound up separated from their creator. In fact, the Adam was away at the time narrative seems a little misogynistic in suggesting that had the man been present, he would have seen through the serpent's lies and forbidden his wife to eat the fruit. There is a passage in the New Testament, also misogynistic in nature, that seems to support said narrative. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. 1 Timothy 2:13 and 14. Of course, if you take that at face value, then you have to add that Adam was not deceived and became a sinner anyway. In other words, the woman sinned in ignorance, but the man sinned in the full knowledge that he did wrong. If that is true, which do you think bears greater responsibility for our current miserable condition? And in fact, the very same author in the New Testament would say in a different location, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ will all be made alive. So even he pins the blame for our condition our being subject to death on Adam. Of course, the point of the story is that once they had believed the serpent's lies about God, they no longer loved him. In fact, they became afraid of him. Witness the first thing the man said when God next contacted them. I was afraid. Given his experience of the world and his creator up to that point, he shouldn't have had a word for afraid. But lies believed break the cycle of love and trust, and where those fail, fear quickly follows. The Bible asserts, 1 John 4, 8 and 16, that God is love. That same book also tells that perfect love drives out fear. That's 1 John 4, 18. So only after they believed Satan's lie that God did not love perfectly could they be afraid. That fear led to self-preservation, the root cause of all sin in our world even today. God wants to dispel the lies his enemy has told about his character. In that service, he has sent us many messages, including the written word, the Bible. Please study with the goal of getting to know his character better, sincerely, me, and so on and so forth. So, yes, there is an extra biblical source that does say, and actually makes quite a point of saying, that if the man had been there, he would have seen through what was going on and forbidden his wife to eat the fruit, and this wouldn't have happened. That one of the root causes of what happened in Genesis 3 was the woman wandering away from the man. I'm not sure that we can make that assumption or reach that conclusion, since even the King James says with her. He doesn't say who was with her, it just says her husband with her. But anyway. And there are those who will add some words to that passage. Maybe you want to tell us what words people add to that? Hello? Are you there? I think she may have already nodded off. There are people who will add the words with her in the garden. So he wasn't right there, he was just with her in the garden. Well, that's adding to, and there are passages in the Bible that tell us not to add to it or to diminish from it, to take anything away from it. I have some building materials in my car right now. I bought them on Monday, still haven't used them. I may have mentioned this before. I'm planning to build a little brick house down in the ground around the main water valve to this house, and then cover it with a wooden cover. And I have now the materials to do that, including a masonry trowel and the premix masonry cement. So we're going to see if I can pull that off. Maybe I'll get to that next week, but I do have the materials. I bought them Monday, so we'll see what happens. Let's bow our heads and then we'll begin our study of the Old Testament. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings to us. We thank you for another week of growth and increased understanding of the world around us and of you. We thank you for that growth. We thank you for what we are able to learn and to improve in our understanding and love. We want to use our examination of the written word now toward that end. We know that that requires the blessing of the Holy Spirit. So we earnestly plead that you will send your Spirit to each individual who hears this. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we left off with Numbers chapter 30 last week. And we then had a little additional on Saturday to discuss Numbers chapter 25 and the story of Phinehas. Phinehas was a grandson of Aaron, the son of Aaron's son Eleazar, and he took a javelin or a spear, whatever you want to call it, and ran it through a couple of people, and it suggested that they were in the act at the time that he did this. That's not stated specifically, but it is kind of suggested. And we looked at some different interpretations, and I just wanted to reiterate the thing that my wife wrote mentioned a book by Greg Boyd, Crucifixion of the Warrior God. That is a book that expresses in two large, hard to read volumes, because it's all written in a scholarly manner, what he calls the cruciform hermeneutic. In other words, a means of understanding the Old Testament that's informed by the cross of Christ and by the picture of God that Christ revealed in his life, teaching, and death. And the death, of course, there on the cross. And he holds the cross to be a central point in the revelation of God. And as Dr. Boyd looked at a lot of the literature that tried to deal with all the violent passages in the Old Testament, a lot of the interpreters would attempt to soft pedal the violence, explain it away, and do these kinds of things. And Dr. Boyd felt that was inadequate. And that's how he developed what he calls his cruciform hermeneutic. And so in the book, he does not soft pedal the violence of the Old Testament. In fact, he hard pedals it almost beyond what might be warranted by the textual witness that we have. And he does that to make the point that we have to have a different approach to understanding that while the Old Testament is God-breathed or inspired, that's a different way to put it, that in fact it presents a faulty, violent picture of God. And the title, Crucifixion of the Warrior God, means he's trying to put out of our minds the idea that God is a violent person and a warrior. And it's kind of a crafty and apt title, because he's pointing to the crucifixion to suggest to us that God is loving and benevolent and non-violent, rather than as the Old Testament depicts him. And he actually goes to the story of the two disciples on the way to Emmaus. We did a sermon presentation on this quite a number of years ago, and it points out that the text there says that Jesus went through the entire Old Testament and pointed out to these disciples how all of these things pointed forward to him. So briefly, his cruciform hermeneutic is to understand that just as Jesus bore our sins on the cross, so in the Old Testament, God bore the sin of his people in his people's description of him in their written discussions of their relationship with him. in which they believed, that's pretty obvious, that God was violent and willing to destroy their enemies on their behalf. And one of the reasons I'm getting into this is because of the verse that we're going to start with. Well, actually, verse 2. But the verse that we start with, verse 31 of Numbers 31, says, "Then the Lord said to Moses." Now, in the past, we have suggested that there are places where the narrative did not say, "The Lord said to Moses," hinting that what Moses did wasn't necessarily what God wanted, because it doesn't say. But in this case, it says specifically that the Lord said to Moses. And I want to suggest that perhaps this is a misrepresentation of God. So let's just read what the text now says that God told Moses. "On behalf of the people of Israel, take revenge on the Midianites for leading them into idolatry. After that, you will die and join your ancestors." Or, as the Old Testament will say later, you will be buried with your fathers, kind of a thing. Although Moses, we believe, probably wasn't buried, and he was later resurrected. At what point in time, we don't know, but he did die there. At any rate, so now when we read chapter 25, we noted that there is an approach to one of the verses in which God didn't say to kill the Midianites, but to vex them. That to me is trying to soft pedal the Old Testament, because we don't believe that God would have authorized even harassment of people. That's not how God works. That's not his character, we don't believe. So to say that God said vex them instead of kill them really doesn't ultimately remove the problem of this passage misrepresenting God's character, which is why I like Greg Boyd's cruciform hermeneutic, which says that in these portrayals, God bears the sin of his people. Now, the next question is, we know that Moses spent 40 years of his life with the Midianites and married the daughter of the priest of Midian, Zipporah, his possibly second wife or more, the one that he married and had 2 sons with while he was in Midian. This woman was a Midianite, the Midianitess, if you wish. And yet now we see him telling the people to take revenge on the Midianites. And let's go ahead and read what happens here to see what they do, for leading them into idolatry. Now, the only mention in chapter 25, the Midianites, was the one woman that this Hebrew man took into his tent in the incident with Phinehas. That's the only time that a Midianite is mentioned. The rest of the time, it's Moabite women. At any rate, let's go on. "So Moses said to the people, choose some men and arm them to fight the Lord's war of revenge against Midian. From each tribe of Israel, send 1,000 men into battle." So they chose 1,000 men from each tribe of Israel, a total of 12,000 men armed for battle. Then Moses sent them out, 1,000 men from each tribe, and Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, led them into battle. Well, that sounds appropriate, since he's the one that committed that violent act back in chapter 25. They carried along the holy objects of the sanctuary and the trumpets for sounding the charge. Now, what holy objects, we don't know. Did they carry the Ark of the Covenant with them into battle? We know that became a problem later, but they carried something along with them, along with the trumpets. They attacked Midian as the Lord had commanded Moses, and they killed all the men. All five of the Midianite kings, Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hor, and Reba, died in a battle. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword. So this is clearly revenge for what had happened there at Baal Peor, which is what we call it, at Peor, and they worship the Baal of Peor, so sometimes it's called Baal Peor. Then the Israelite army captured the Midianite women and children and seized their cattle and flocks and all their wealth as plunder. They burned all the towns and villages where the Midianites had lived. Does this make them sound like a violent rabble? Wow, the raiders go in, kill the men, burn the villages, capture the women and children. Yeah. After they had gathered the plunder and captives, both people and animals, they brought them all to Moses and Eleazar the priest and to the whole community of Israel, which was camped on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River across from Jericho. Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. But Moses was furious with all the generals and captains who had returned from the battle. And the footnote there says that what the Hebrew says is the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds. So there would have been a commander from each tribe for the 1,000 that went with them, and there would have been 10 commanders from each tribe that would have had charge of 100 men, which is what they suggest is roughly the role of a captain in modern military parlance. Why have you let all the women live, he demanded. These are the very ones who followed Balaam's advice and caused the people of Israel to rebel against the Lord at Mount Peor. They are the ones who caused the plague to strike the Lord's people. So kill all the boys and all the women who have had intercourse with a man. Only the young girls who are virgins may live. You may keep them for yourselves. And all of you who have killed anyone or touched a dead body must stay outside the camp for 7 days. You must purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd and 7th days. Purify all your clothing too, and everything made of leather, goat hair, or wood. Then Eleazar the priest said to the men who were in the battle, the Lord has given Moses this legal requirement. Anything made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, or lead, that is, all metals that do not burn, must be passed through fire in order to be made ceremonially pure. These metal objects must then be further purified with the water of purification. The water of purification is clearly ceremonial. The fire would actually have a purifying effect, particularly if there were infectious contaminants on these items. But everything that burns must be purified by the water alone. On the 7th day you must wash your clothes and be purified, then you may return to the camp. Now, before we get into the division of the plunder, what do we think is going on here? If, as I'm trying to hold here, this isn't something that God ordered, then it would have to be something that Moses did. Moses was married to a Midianitess. What is going on that he would order this violent vengeance against the Midianites? 2 possibilities come to mind. First of all, the Midianites were likely as numerous as the Israelites, or even more numerous. Abraham's son Isaac had 2 sons, only one of which became the progenitor of the nation of Israel, whereas Abraham's son Midian, in the record, has a number of sons, all of whom become progenitors of the people who would be known as the Midianites. Would sending only 12,000 men to battle be sufficient to deal with that large a group of people. And I say that to suggest that it may have been a subset of the clan of Midian that Moses deals with here. And that sub-clan may indeed have been rivals to the clan that Moses was associated with through his 40 years as the shepherd for Jethro or Reuel, and the clan of his wife Zipporah, who by this time may not have been alive anymore. Back in those days, women tended not to live quite as long as men, at least according to the record. So she may or may not have been alive at this time. But that may be what's going on. Another possibility, and again, I'm not saying any of these things are exactly true. I'm just suggesting these are possibilities for you to consider. Another possibility is that having been so closely related to the Midianites throughout his life, for the past almost 80 years, essentially 80 years, that Moses was kind of blindsided by the participation of Midianites in what the Moabites did and in the scheme of Balaam to get the Israelites cursed, as Balak, son of Beor, the king of Moab, had wanted. And so, having been blindsided like that, he flew into a rage and he ordered all of this. Now, there are some traditions in Old Testament history that kind of have their origins here, and one of them is that when they went to war, they very often would kill all the men, including male children, but they would keep, and they would also kill any women who were not virgins, but they would keep the virgins for themselves, which of course then was polygamous, it was misogynist, etc., etc. You know, we can admit all of that is going on. And we do not hold that this is God's ideal. This is not what God wants. This is just what the Israelites did. This is the faulty, broken condition, even of the people that God was choosing for himself to have a place to bring Jesus to the world. So now let's read on. Division of the plunder. And the Lord said to Moses, you and Eleazar the priest and the family leaders of each tribe are to make a list of all the plunder taken in the battle, including the people and animals. Then divide the plunder into two parts and give half to the men who fought the battle and half to the rest of the people. Now, there were 12,000 men who fought the battle. We know from the census that was taken just before this that there were about 600,000 men. Wow. Yeah, so this is a very small portion. That small portion, because they had gone into battle, would get half of the plunder. Everybody else would have to divide up the other half. Then it goes on to say, from the army's portion, first give the Lord his share of the plunder, one of every 500 of the prisoners and of the cattle, donkeys, sheep, and goats. Give this share of the army's half to Eleazar the priest as an offering to the Lord. From the half that belongs to the people of Israel, take one of every 50 of the prisoners and of the cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, and other animals. Give this share to the Levites, who are in charge of maintaining the Lord's tabernacle. So we don't know how many people they captured. I mean, it was down to all the boys and all the non-virgin women were killed, so all that was left was any virgin women. And one out of every 500, we don't know how many there were, but there probably weren't a whole lot out of the animals and the prisoners that would have gone to Eleazar. The out of the people's half, one of every 50. So it would have been essentially 10 times as many. And that went to the rest of the Levites. Anyway, says, concludes verse 31 there. Then, so Moses and Eleazar the priest did as the Lord commanded Moses. The plunder remaining from everything the fighting men had taken totaled 675,000 sheep and goats, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 virgin girls. So there, now we've got numbers. So, out of 32,000 virgin girls, if you divide them up by half, it would have been 16,000 for the people as a whole, and 16,000 for the 12,000 fighting men. Now, if you take one out of every 500, or 1/5 of 1%, I think that is. Yeah. Do the math real quick. 5 goes into 16,000. 3 times 32. It would have been 3,200. Well, it would have been 320, actually. 320 of these virgins would have gone to Eleazar. Wow. Did I get that right? 320? I think so. Anyway, and then 3,200 to the rest of the Levites. And then you could do the same math with the animals and so on and so forth. Half the plunder was given to fighting men. It totaled 337,500 sheep and goats, of which 675 were the Lord's share, 36,000 cattle, of which 72 were the Lord's share, 30,500 donkeys, of which 62 were the Lord's share, and 16,000 virgin girls, okay, I got the math wrong, of whom 32 were the Lord's share. Moses gave all the Lord's share to Eleazar the priest, just as the Lord had directed him. Half the plunder belonged to the people of Israel. Moses separated it from the half belonging to the fighting men. It totaled the same numbers, 337,500 sheep and goats, 36,000 cattle, 30,500 donkeys, and 16,000 virgin girls. From the half share given to the people, Moses took one of every 50 prisoners and animals and gave them to the Levites, who maintained the Lord's tabernacle. All this was done as the Lord had commanded Moses. Again, if there were 16,000 virgin girls and only 32 were taken out, you have 12,000 men dividing up essentially 968 girls. Yeah, pretty obvious polygamy going on here. Although some of the girls they may have raised as daughters instead of as sister wives. But at any rate. And then it says, all this was done as the Lord had commanded Moses. Then all the generals and captains came to Moses and said, we, your servants, have accounted for all the men who went out to battle under our command. Not one of us is missing. So we are presenting the items of gold we captured as an offering to the Lord from our share of the plunder, armbands, bracelets, rings, earrings, and necklaces. This will purify our lives before the Lord and make us right with him. This was their atonement offering. That's what the footnote tells us. So Moses and Eleazar the priest received the gold from all the military commanders, all kinds of jewelry and crafted objects. In all, the gold that the generals and captains presented as a gift to the Lord weighed about 420 pounds. And the footnote says about 16,750 shekels, or about 191 kilograms. All the fighting men had taken some of the plunder for themselves. So Moses and Eleazar the priest accepted the gold from the generals and captains and brought the gold to the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting, as a reminder to the Lord that the people of Israel belonged to him. Yeah. Then it talks about the tribes east of the Jordan, and this gets kind of interesting because, again, we hold that this idea of violent military conquest was not God's idea. This was the people's idea. But because it's the people's idea, now there's an issue of fairness brought up. The tribes of Reuben and Gad owned vast numbers of livestock. So when they saw the lands of Jazer and Gilead were ideally suited for their flocks and herds, they came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the other leaders of the community. They said, notice the towns of Ataroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Eliah, Sibmah, and the footnote gives an alternative name for Sibmah, Nebo, and Beon. The Lord has conquered this whole area for the community of Israel, and it is ideally suited for all our livestock. If we have found favor with you, please let us have this land as our property instead of giving us land across the Jordan River. So, these are what are called the Transjordan tribes, or in this version's title, the tribes east of Jordan, the East Bank tribes. Do you intend to stay here while your brothers go across and do all the fighting? Moses asked the men of Gad and Reuben. Why do you want to discourage the rest of the people of Israel from going across to the land the Lord has given them? Your ancestor did the same thing when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. After they went up to the valley of Eshcol and explored the land, they discouraged the people of Israel from entering the land the Lord was giving them. Then the Lord was very angry with them, and he vowed, of all those I rescued from Egypt, no one who is 20 years old or older will ever see the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they have not obeyed me wholeheartedly. The only exceptions are Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, son of Nun, for they have wholeheartedly followed the Lord. The Lord was angry with Israel and made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the entire generation that sinned in the Lord's sight had died. But here you are, a brood of sinners, doing exactly the same thing. Well, this is Moses' take on it, and he's getting very accusatory in what he's saying. You are making the Lord even angrier with Israel. If you turn away from him like this and he abandons them again in the wilderness, you will be responsible for destroying this entire nation. Whoa. Yeah, I think Moses is kind of going overboard here. But anyway. But they approached Moses and said, we simply want to build pens for our livestock and fortified towns for our wives and children. Then we will arm ourselves and lead our fellow Israelites into battle until we have brought them safely to their land. Meanwhile, our families will stay in the fortified towns we build here, so they will be safe from any attacks by the local people. We will not return to our homes until all the people of Israel have received their portions of the land. But we do not claim any of the land on the other side of the Jordan. We would rather live here on the east side and accept this as our grant of land. Then Moses said, well, they're engaging in negotiation and they're trying to find a workable compromise. And their compromise is, we're not trying to skip the hard work. We're willing to do the hard work to help the rest of the tribes get their land. We'll do that. Just let us have this land and put our flocks and wives and children here while we do that. And then Moses said, if you keep your word and arm yourselves for the Lord's battles, and if your troops cross the Jordan and keep fighting until the Lord has driven out his enemies, then you may return when the Lord has conquered the land. You will have fulfilled your duty to the Lord and to the rest of the people of Israel. And the land on the east side of the Jordan will be your property from the Lord. But if you fail to keep your word, then you will have sinned against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Go ahead and build towns for your families and pens for your flocks, but do everything you have promised. You may be aware that verse 23, the last portion, is a saying that parents used to use on their children. Might still, but certainly back in my day, I can remember having that told to me. My parents would point to the evidence that I had done something wrong and would say, quote, be sure your sin will find you out. Well, understood in its context, Moses is simply saying that if you don't do what you've promised, everybody's going to know it. It's going to be obvious. Then the men of Gad and Reuben replied, we, your servants, will follow your instructions exactly. Our children, wives, flocks, and cattle will stay here in the towns of Gilead, but all who are able to bear arms will cross over to fight for the Lord, just as you have said. And the record of the Old Testament is that these men did, in fact, keep their promise. There were more troubles that came up after that, and there had to be more negotiations, telling us that these people were still contentious and toxic as they took their own land. That's kind of what we're going to see as we go on through the narrative. But at this point, we do know that they kept the promise that they're making here. So Moses gave orders to Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the leaders of the clans of Israel. He said, the men of Gad and Reuben, who are armed for battle, must cross the Jordan with you to fight for the Lord. If they do, give them the land of Gilead as their property when the land is conquered. But if they refuse to arm themselves and cross over with you, then they must accept land with the rest of you in the land of Canaan. The tribes of Gad and Reuben again said, we are your servants, and we will do as the Lord has commanded. We will cross the Jordan into Canaan fully armed to fight for the Lord, but our property will be here on this side of the Jordan. So Moses assigned land to the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph. He gave them the territory of King Sihon of the Amorites and the land of King Og of Bashan, the whole land with its cities and surrounding lands. The descendants of Gad built the towns of Dibon, Ataroth, Aroer, Atroth Shophan, Jazer, Jogbehah, Beth Nimrah, and Beth Haran. Beth is the Hebrew word that means house of, so house of Nimrah and house of Haran. These were all fortified towns with pens for their flocks. The descendants of Reuben built the towns of Heshbon, Eleah, Kiriathaim, Nebo, Baal-Meon, and Sibmah. And the Sibmah was mentioned earlier. There's an alternative name for it. The Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek version, but the Hebrew reads Sebam instead of Sibmah. I'm like, whoop-de-doo, different way to word it. Spelled differently, that was common. They changed the names of some of the towns they conquered and rebuilt. Then the descendants of Machir, of the tribe of Manasseh, went to Gilead and conquered it, and they drove out the Amorites living there. So Moses gave Gilead to the Machirites, descendants of Manasseh, and they settled there. The people of Jair, another clan of the tribe of Manasseh, captured many of the towns in Gilead and changed the name of that region to the towns of Jair, or Havoth Jair. Meanwhile, a man named Noba captured the town of Kenath and its surrounding villages, and he renamed that area Noba after himself. So, some of the tribes took the land that was already conquered, and some of them actually went out and conquered additional land to take for themselves. This passage will probably go through rather quickly. It says, this is the route the Israelites followed as they marched out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses and Aaron at the Lord's direction. Moses kept a written record of their progress. These are the stages of their march, identified by the different places where they stopped along the way. And this is all pretty highly speculative because most of these places we really don't know where they are. Now, nowadays, a lot of people think they know where Mount Sinai is. You may know that I have doubts about that simply because I don't think there was enough flat land around that mountain to house all the people. But there were places around mountains in what we today call Saudi Arabia that might have held that. It's just a theory, so I can't say that for sure. I'm not going to tell you have to believe that. The point I'm making is that we really, you can read this, you can say all the names, but it really doesn't tell us where they went. So as you go through this, it says they set out from the city of Ramses in early spring, 15th day of the first month, the morning after the first Passover celebration, and that would have been sometime March, April, maybe even early May. The people of Israel left defiantly in full view of all the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were bearing all their firstborn sons, and the Lord had killed the night before, their take on it, of course. The Lord had defeated the gods of Egypt that night with great acts of judgment. So Ramses, Succoth, Etham, Pi Hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon, camping near Migdol. From Pi Hahiroth, they crossed the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds. That's what that footnote's going to tell us. The Hebrew calls it the Sea of Reeds. Generally, it's believed that's the Red Sea. Into the wilderness beyond. Then they traveled for 3 days into the Etham wilderness and camped at Marah. Marah was where the water was bitter. They left Marah and camped at Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. They left Elim and camped beside the Reed Sea, or the Red Sea, again. Probably a different part of it, maybe farther south. They left the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. Footnote there, footnote E, says that Sin is derived from the name for Sinai. The wilderness of Sin is the area around the mountain that is called Sinai in this narrative, and has no relationship to the English word sin, which should be pretty obvious. Excuse me. They left the wilderness of Sin, camped at Dophkah, and it's very after Rephidim. They camped in the wilderness of Sinai. They left Sinai, went to Kibroth Hattaavah, and it goes through there and named all these different places. These places were during the 40 years. And you come to the end of the 40 years, so here about verse 36, when they left Ezion Geber and camped at Kadesh. Kadesh is where they had originally spied out the land and made the decision that they weren't able to take the land and got turned back into the wilderness. So now they're coming back there. So this verse 36 is near the end now of the 40 years. They left Kadesh, camped at Mount Hor at the border of Edom. While they were at the foot of Mount Hor, Aaron the priest was directed by the Lord to go up the mountain, and there he died. This happened in midsummer on the first day of the 5th month of the 40th year. So, yeah, there it is. We know it is 40 years here. After Israel's departure from Egypt. So it hasn't been quite 40 years since the incident where God had assigned them 40 years, but it's getting close. Aaron was 123 years old when he died there on Mount Hor. At that time, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev in the land of Canaan, heard that the people of Israel were approaching his land. Doesn't tell us any more about it, just throws that in there for some reason. Meanwhile, the Israelites left Mount Hor, camped at Zalmonah, left Zalmonah, camped at Punan, left Punan, camped at Oboth, left Oboth, camped at Iabarim on the border of Moab. They left Iabarim and camped at Dibon Gad. They left Dibon Gad, camped at Almon Diblathaim. They left Almon Diblathaim and camped in the mountains east of the river, near Mount Nebo. And this is, well, you know the name, some of you know the name Nebo and know what's significant about it. They left the mountains east of the river, camped on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River, across from Jericho. Along the Jordan River, they camped from Beth Jeshimoth as far as the meadows of Acacia on the plains of Moab. And I'll bet you that footnote I is going to say, yeah, Abel Shittim. Okay. Oh, you woke up. Hello?
Yeah, I did.
I asked you a question earlier and got no response, so I assumed you were asleep.
I was.
I don't remember what the question was now. Apparently
When I got started, I was going to fall asleep on you.
Yeah. Did you go to sleep while I was reading my Bible question answer?
I don't know.
Because we came to a point, and I was going to ask you a question, and I ended up having to answer it myself. But I don't remember what it was right now. It was at the beginning of Numbers 31, I think.
What was your question?
I don't remember. I have to go back there and look and see if I can remember it. Okay, let's see. All right. So while they were camped near the Jordan River on the plains of Moab opposite Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you cross the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the people living there. You must destroy all their carved and molten images and demolish all their pagan shrines. Take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given it to you to occupy. You must distribute the land among the clans by sacred lot and in proportion to their size. A larger portion of land will be allotted to each of the larger clans. A smaller portion will be allotted to each of the smaller clans. The decision of the sacred lot is final. In other words, you're not going to fight about it. We're going to do it at random, by sacred lot, and you're not going to argue with that. In this way, the portions of land will be divided among your ancestral tribes. But if you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, notice it says drive out, not kill, but at any rate, if you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, those who remain will be like splinters in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land where you live, and I will do to you what I had planned to do to them. Moving on then. Boundaries of the land. And again, I'm going to just kind of blow by this pretty quickly, but just point out the general layout of the boundaries of the land. Again, some of the names we're not certain of, so we can't go out and draw an exact map of this. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, give these instructions to the Israelites. When you come into the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your special possession, these will be the boundaries. The southern portion of your country will extend from the wilderness of Zin along the edge of Edom. The southern boundary will begin on the east at the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea is what the Hebrew says. It will then run south past Scorpion Pass in the direction of Zin. Its southernmost point will be Kadesh Barnea, from which it will go to Hazar Adar and on to Asmon. From Asmon, the boundary will turn toward the brook of Egypt and end at the Mediterranean Sea. And let's see, footnote C, I'd read that. The sea, yeah. I mean, that was the big sea there at that part of the world, so they would call that the sea. Your western boundary will be the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, that's pretty easy to understand. Your western boundary will be, oh yeah, okay, I just read that and skipped out because I saw the footnote. Got thrown off. Your northern boundary will begin at the Mediterranean Sea, doesn't say where along there, and run east toward Mount Hor, then to Lebo Hamath and on through Zedad and Ziphron to Hazar Enan. This will be your northern boundary. The eastern boundary will start at Hazar Enan and run south to Shephem, then down to Riblah on the east side of Ain. From there, the boundary will run down along the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee. Footnote there tells us the Sea of Kinnereth, but it became known as Galilee later. And then along the Jordan River to the Dead Sea. These are the boundaries of your land. So, and that's roughly what we understand. The Jordan, the Mediterranean, and then northern and southern boundaries with, the Jordan dumping into the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea, and then the Dead Sea. And so then, the land turning up from there. And just for the fun of it, let me, and I'm sorry, I forgot to switch camera here so you get out, read with me. That's my fault. I've done that twice now. I'm getting old and forgetful. I wanted to look at the boundaries of Israel today and see how they relate to what is stated there. Of course, now it's going to take a long time to load. Now, modern Israel goes way down here to the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea. But the narrative there that we just read talks about the Dead Sea and going across to wherever Kadesh Barnea was. And that may have been just north here of what's today known as the Gaza Strip, the land of the Philistines. In fact, Ashkelon and Ashdod were also cities of the Philistines. So it would have, they would have had their territory joining the Mediterranean here and going up to north. Again, let me zoom out a little bit so we can see the national boundaries. They kind of include a jog there. then come down, and you can see that the modern boundary does go along the eastern edge of, sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias, the Kinnereth, or the Sea of Galilee, and then follows the Jordan River, with this territory being known as the West Bank. Anyway, just that was to be the boundaries of their land. And again, I'm sure I've never seen anybody try and give an exact map of what those boundaries are. So this territory, Moses told the Israelites, is the homeland you are to divide among yourselves by sacred lot. The Lord has commanded that the land be divided among the 9.5 remaining tribes. The families of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh have already received their grants of land on the east side of the Jordan River, across from Jericho toward the sunrise. And the Lord said to Moses, Eleazar the priest and Joshua son of Nun are the men designated to divide the grants of land among the people. Enlist one leader from each tribe to help them with the task. These are the tribes and the names of the leaders: Judah, Caleb; Simeon, Shemuel; Benjamin, Eladad; Dan, Buki; Manasseh, Haniel; Ephraim, Kemuel; Zebulun, Elizaphan; Issachar, Paltiel; Asher, Ahihud; Naphtali, Pedahel, and of course son of there and also forth. These are the men the Lord has appointed to divide the grants of land in Canaan among the Israelites. Now this gets a little bit more interesting, because now we're going to read about towns for the Israelites and the cities of refuge. While Israel was camped beside the Jordan on the plains of Moab across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, Command the people of Israel to give to the Levites from their property certain towns to live in, along with the surrounding pasture lands. These towns will be for the Levites to live in, and the surrounding lands will provide pasture for their cattle, flocks, and other livestock. The pasture land assigned to the Levites around these towns will extend 1,500 feet from the town walls in every direction, measure off 3,000 feet outside the town walls in every direction, east, south, west, north, with the town at the center. This area will serve as the larger pasture land for the towns. So that 1,500 feet is 1,000 cubits, or about 460 meters. And of course, then if you double that, because it's on each side, then the total area would have crossed about 2,000 cubits, or about 3,000 feet. Now, these were not necessarily farmlands, but pasture lands. It was land that the Levites would have to do some level of agriculture, even though that was not their main task. 6 of the towns you give to the Levites will be cities of refuge, where a person who has accidentally killed someone can flee for safety. In addition, give them 42 other towns, so a total of 48. In all, 48 towns with their surrounding pasture land will be given to the Levites. These towns will come from the property of the people of Israel. The larger tribes will give more towns to the Levites, while the smaller tribes will give fewer. Each tribe will give property in proportion to the size of its land. So in other words, there would be Levites living among all of the tribes of Israel. And then 6 of those, 3 east of the Jordan and 3 west of the Jordan, we haven't read that part yet, would be called cities of refuge. So now we get the description of the cities of refuge. Now, this whole thing depends on the people having accepted and living under a common tradition of the people at the time, and that tradition being the avenger of blood. Recall what God said to Noah when Noah and his family left the ark and gave him offerings, and God put his bow in the clouds. God told him then, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man. So God created us in his image, and because of that, then we have a sense of right and of justice. However, we are broken and flexible, broken and damaged now because of sin. So that image has been marred and it has been misdirected, because now our sense of justice focuses not on others but on ourselves. So now, if you kill somebody, you kill my brother, well, it's my right to go out and kill you now. Of course, once you do that, then you've got a non-ending cycle of murders. You kill my brother, I kill you. Oh, well, I've killed you now, so now your brother's going to kill me. That just has no end. God is going to put limits on that with these instructions about the cities of refuge. So he says, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, designate cities of refuge to which people can flee if they've killed someone accidentally. These cities will be places of protection from a dead person's relatives who want to avenge the death. The slayer must not be put to death before being tried by the community. Designate 6 cities of refuge for yourselves, 3 on the east side of the Jordan River and 3 on the west in the land of Canaan. These cities are for the protection of Israelites, foreigners living among you, and traveling merchants. Anyone who accidentally kills someone may flee there for safety. In other words, God is saying, I know that in your broken condition, you have warped my character into an excuse to act in vengeance instead of healing. And because of that, then I need to set limits on what you're going to do. And those limits are expressed to us here in the cities of refuge. They will protect you. The avenger of blood may not enter the city of refuge. He may only appeal to its elders to hold a trial where he then gets to demonstrate that the killing was not accidental. And if he did, then he gets to go ahead and take the life of the murderer. But if it was accidental, then he does not. And, well, I think we'll read that here, the other provisions that are made here. But if someone strikes and kills another person with a piece of iron, it is murder, and the murderer must be executed. Or if someone with a stone in his hand strikes and kills another person, it is murder, and the murderer must be put to death. Or if someone strikes and kills another person with a wooden object, it is murder, and the murderer must be put to death. In other words, if you use a weapon to do it, it's no longer accidental, it's murder, and now the relatives have the right to exact vengeance. The victim's nearest relative is responsible for putting the murderer to death. When they meet, the avenger must put the murderer to death. Well, this is their take on it, obviously. So if someone hates another person and waits an ambush, then pushes him or throws something at him and he dies, it is murder. Or if someone hates another person and hits him with a fist and he dies, it is murder. In such cases, the avenger must put the murderer to death when they meet. But suppose someone pushes another person without having shown previous hostility, or throws something that unintentionally hits another person, or accidentally drops a huge stone on someone, though they were not enemies, and the person dies. If this should happen, the community must follow these regulations in making a judgment between the slayer and the avenger, the victim's nearest relative. The community must protect the slayer from the avenger, and must escort the slayer back to live in the city of refuge to which he fled. There he must remain until the death of the high priest, who was anointed with the sacred oil. Now that's kind of a strange provision, but it is the provision that was given here. If you accidentally killed someone, you could be protected from the avenger of blood by living in the city of refuge. And that protection lasted only if you stayed in the city until the death of the high priest. Once the high priest died, then that protection covered you anywhere you went. You could now leave the city of refuge. And we may draw something from that here in a moment. But if the slayer ever leaves the limits of the city of refuge, and the avenger finds him outside the city and kills him, it will not be considered murder. The slayer should have stayed inside the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer may return to his own property. These are legal requirements for you to observe from generation to generation wherever you may live. All murderers must be put to death, but only if evidence is presented by more than one witness. No one may be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. So God is setting up legal protections. Maybe not the level of legal protections that we might be used to today. Certainly not the level of legal protections that he would have preferred. But these are what God believes his people are capable of accepting at that point in their development, and that's what he gives them. Also, you must never accept a ransom payment for the life of someone judged guilty of murder and subject to execution. Murderers must always be put to death. And again, a lot of people like to take this as biblical command that you have to have the death penalty, and any nation that does not approve the death penalty cannot be approved of by God because God has ordered the death penalty. We believe that misrepresents the character of God. Yes, in this time, the people would have believed that it was God's order and would have written it down that way. And according to Dr. Boyd's cruciform hermeneutic, this is God bearing the sin of his people in the description of him given in the God-breathed written word. And never accept a ransom payment from someone who has fled to a city of refuge, allowing a slayer to return to his property before the death of the high priest. This will ensure that the land where you live will not be polluted, for murder pollutes the land. And no sacrifice except the execution of the murderer can purify the land from murder. Now, this is a ritual thing. And I think that footnote C will say, atonement for murder. You must not defile the land where you live, for I live there myself. I am the Lord who lives among the people of Israel. I think what we should understand here is God is trying to limit the amount of killing that takes place among a people for whom life was cheap, and killing one another was just kind of the way of life for them. And he's trying to say, let's back off on all the killing here. And he sets limits on it. Now, granted, they write it as if it's an order that the death penalty must be carried out in cases of murder. But again, I'm not going to take a political position there. I don't think that's appropriate. We're just noting that we don't think that is God's ideal. That's just what he assigned to the people at the time. Once more, the daughters of Zelophehad get a mention here. We ran into that last week. Then the heads of the clans of Gilead, the descendants of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came to Moses and the family leaders of Israel with a petition. They said, "Sir, the Lord instructed you to divide the land by sacred lot among the people of Israel. You were told by the Lord to give the grant of land owned by our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. But if they marry men from another tribe, their grants of land will go with them to the tribe into which they marry. In this way, the total area of our tribal land will be reduced." You hear somebody here being selfish? We don't want to lose land. We want to make sure our clan gets our stuff, us versus them thinking. That's what I'm hearing here. Then when the year of Jubilee comes, their portion of land will be added to that of the new tribe, causing it to be lost forever to our ancestral tribe. So Moses gave the Israelites this command from the Lord. The claim of the men from the tribe of Joseph is legitimate. This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry anyone they like as long as it is within their own ancestral tribe. None of the territorial land may pass from tribe to tribe, for all the land given to each tribe must remain within the tribe to which it was first allotted. I think we can take this again in the same way that we took the bit about the cities of refuge. God sees these people being selfish and tribal and territorial, etc., etc. And he is allowing that with limits. So he's saying, okay, I can see this is going to be a problem. So if women inherit land for whatever reason, then they need to marry within their tribe so that I won't have to deal with you guys getting up in arms because land is passing from one tribe to another. And so, in fact, verse 9 there he says specifically, no grant of land may pass from one tribe to another. Each tribe of Israel must keep its allotted portion of land. And all this is in the context of the system that God set up, where a family had a permanent right to the land allotted to them. You could never permanently sell the land. You could only sell the land for the period of time from the date of the sale to the year of Jubilee. On the year of Jubilee, the land returned to the original grantee. The daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord commanded Moses. Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah all married cousins on their father's side. They married into the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. Thus their inheritance of land remained within their ancestral tribe. These are the commands and regulations that the Lord gave to the people of Israel through Moses while they were camped on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River across from Jericho. And I think that is the end of the book of Numbers. It is. We just came up to Deuteronomy. I'm looking at our time here. We might end a little bit short. I'm thinking I don't want to start a whole new book right now, that we'll just kind of end it a little bit early tonight, and we'll get into this. There are sections of Deuteronomy that I want to focus on a little bit, particularly chapter 6, but there are other parts of it that we will probably blow through rather quickly, including some of this review of the Israelite history here in chapter 1. Remembering Israel's wandering, that's more of their history, chapter 2. Victory over Sihon of Heshbon, and then, let's see. Victory over Og of Bashan. Land division east of the Jordan. We've all kind of gone through that. Moses forbidden to enter the land. Let's see. I'm kind of going through this quickly here, so we might start farther into the book. Moses urges Israel to obey. Warning against idolatry. Only one God. Eastern cities of refuge. Introduction to Moses' second address. 10 Commandments for the Covenant Community. These are a little bit different. In fact, why don't we go ahead and read through those here while we're here and see how they are different from the ones in Exodus. So, it says, Moses is repeating this. Now, he spoke to me and I passed his words on to you. This is what he said. This is quotation from Moses. Now he's instructing the people and he's giving them these commandments. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. So that's the first commandment. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth, or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. And we have pointed out that 1,000 generations, if you take even, say, 20 years per generation, that if you have 1,000 generations, well, that's still 20,000 years. And that pretty much covers the history of the earth as we understand it. Anyway, going on. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. And misuse can be understood in many ways. And we suggest that if you attribute to God characteristics that are contrary to his character as revealed on the cross, that you are misusing his name, because the name represents the character. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your oxen and donkeys, and other livestock, and any foreigners living among you. All your male and female servants must rest as you do. And this clarifies even more than what we read in Exodus, my concept of this as workers' rights legislation. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day. Don't do to other people what happened to you. And we know from modern people that is something that people have to be reminded. Something bad happens to them, they seem to think that it's now obligatory for them to pass that bad on to the people who follow them. God is saying, no, you don't do it that way. You were slaves and mistreated. Do not mistreat your workers. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you. Then you will live a long, full life in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. And this is a point that regards what we read about the cities of refuge. The legal protection was that you could not execute a murderer on the testimony of only one witness. If there was only one witness to say that the death was a murder, then you couldn't convict. You had to let him stay in the city of refuge. Number 21, the 10th of the commandments. You must not covet your neighbor's wife. You must not covet your neighbor's house or land, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Now here, this rendering of the commandment does open the door to the division of the commandments in the Catholic Catechism, in which the second commandment is rendered here is left out, and this one is divided in two, because it does play coveting your neighbor's wife first. So that's in the Catholic Catechism, that's the 9th commandment, and then the rest, you must not covet your neighbor's house or land, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. That's the 10th commandment. And that's only in the Catholic Catechism. And I don't know if it's still that way to this day, but I know at one time it was that way. The Lord spoke these words to all of you assembled there at the foot of the mountain. He spoke with a loud voice from the heart of the fire, surrounded by clouds and deep darkness. This was on why deep darkness? So that the people would not be destroyed by his glory, I would say. But it was fire. That's his glory. Our God is a consuming fire, the Bible tells us. This was all he said at that time, and he wrote his words on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. So God, and I'm just kind of scanning through that real quickly. Verse 32, Moses told the people, you must be careful to obey all the commands of the Lord your God, following his instructions in every detail. Now, I wonder here how much of what's written here is what was put down in Moses' day, and I wonder if perhaps some of this was modified after the Babylonian captivity. Some people have suggested that the Israelites went in captivity to the Chaldeans in Babylon, and there they learned the approach to living of the Chaldeans, commerce, and the rule of law. The Babylonians had their Hammurabi, the great giver of law, that set the stage for their society and their culture and their civilization as they knew it. And the Israelites began to think, hey, look, we've got our own lawgiver. We've got our own Hammurabi. We have Moses. So I wonder if sometimes some of what's in here was kind of enhanced by the Jews in the days after the Babylonian captivity as they wanted to establish Moses' reputation as their giver of law. Now that was chapter 5, so here's chapter 6, and this is what I want to examine in more detail, and we'll probably do that next week. We're closer to the amount of time that we usually give for this study, so I think that we'll put an end to it here, and we'll pick up with Deuteronomy chapter 6 next week. Anything you want to say, or did you go to sleep again? I think maybe she went to sleep again. All right, so we invite you to join us again next week, and until then we say goodbye and God bless.